Welcome to Whiteboard Friday. This week, the question on everyone's lips is, why is Greece on the slide? Why is Greece on the slide? I like that one. The rest of the office didn't get it, but hey, I like it. So it's a real issue that Greece is in. It's actually not a laughing matter. They're facing some pretty awful times at the moment. But let's look at why this problem came about and why it's going to be so difficult to fix. Of course, it all started when Greece joined the euro. And a way to do this is tell a nice little story about a chap called Hans, a German worker, and a chap called Dimitri, a Greek worker. Dimitri makes olive oil, say. Hans probably manufactures automobiles. Hans is pretty good with his hands. We're full of it today. Hans is good with his hands, and so since in the 15 years since Greece joined the euro, Hans has got better and better with his hands, and that means he actually makes more automobiles than he used to back in the year 2000. Whereas Dimitri is pretty much turning out the same amount of olive oil that he used to turn out way back then. In fact, over the time since the euro began, German workers are roughly 30% more productive than their cousins in southern Europe, like Greece, Italy, and Spain. 30%. That means they're turning out 30% more automobiles than they used to compared to the improvements that's been made in southern Europe. So Hans can afford to have quite a big pay rise. In fact, he can afford to get paid 30% more because he's turning out 30% more automobiles. He has a right to ask for that. Fair enough. But because we're in the euro, everyone's sitting down in southern Europe going, actually, why is Hans getting a 30% pay rise? I want a 30% pay rise too. The trouble with that, of course, is that if you're churning out the same amount of olive oil as you were before, then that olive oil is going to have to get more and more expensive. And that's been the trouble that's been faced in Spain and Italy and in Greece throughout the 2000s. Their workers have become relatively more and more expensive, but they want the same wages that they're seeing in Germany. So as a result, the only way to, of course, to fund this, to keep funding higher wages in Greece and Spain and Italy, is for them to borrow euros off the Germans and other countries. And of course, that's one of the advantages of a currency union, is that it's cheaper to borrow. You've got more people using the same currency, so it becomes, interest rates get a lot lower and it becomes a lot cheaper to borrow. So Greece has borrowed a lot of money to try to keep up with the Joneses, or in this case, the Schmidts, to try and keep up with the earnings of countries like Germany. And that's really why they have got such a big debt that's built up over time. Now, normally, in the situation that Greece is in now, normally what would happen is that if they had their own currency, that currency would fall. If it was the drachma, that currency would fall. So Dimitri would not feel like he was getting a massive pay cut, but he would be effectively earning, the drachmas he would be earning, he'd be able to buy less stuff overseas than he would have been able to before. So the value of his earnings would fall and he'd be able to stay more or less competitive with Hans. Okay? But because they're all in the euro, the only way for Dimitri to stay competitive with Hans is to take a pay cut. No one likes a pay cut, do they? You think about it. Do you like a pay cut? No, you don't. The psychology of this stuff is really difficult. So the Greeks and a lot of other southern European countries are busily trying to avoid a pay cut, whereas actually that's what they need to do if they're to stay competitive with Hans. The only other option, of course, is to leave the euro and go back to their own currency, which would allow them a bit more, give them a bit more of a buffer in terms of allowing them not to have to take a pay cut nominally in the pay packet that they take home, but they'd be taking a pay cut in that their currency would fall, and of course they'd be able to buy less, import less stuff from the outside world. Now, the reason that big currency unions like the United States work is because really two things can happen. One, you've got a welfare system. So effectively, Hans is sending money to Dimitri, who might live in a poor area. Hans lives in a rich area. He'd be sending money over through welfare and health payments and education payments, and that helps, keep the poor areas afloat. The other way that works in a country like the United States is that people like Dimitri would move to the richer areas and work with people like Hans, so they would become more productive over time as well. So that allows, that sort of mobility allows people to move from poor areas to the richer areas and receive those higher incomes. The trouble is that neither of those things happen in Europe to the same degree that they happen in a place like America, because of course Dimitri speaks a different language to Hans, so it's much more difficult to move to those places, and there's no welfare system within Europe. So the reality facing the Greeks is that they've got to take a massive pay cut in order to stay competitive with the Germans. Even if this short-term crisis gets solved, that basic reality is going to stick around, because the Germans will keep getting more productive because they're good with their hands, and the Greeks probably not so much unless they really reform their economy. So the other choice, as I said, is for them to leave the euro, go back to the drachma, and allow that currency depreciation to bear some of the cost, effectively give the Greeks the pay cut that they need. So that is why ultimately the Germans right now are so happy, the Greeks so unhappy.